Hello, I'm Professor Fred Long. I'd like to welcome you to Koine Greek Grammar. We're looking at Chapter 20. This chapter will introduce the contract verbs. We'll have to look at contract vowels and how they combine with endings to form verb endings that might be difficult to recognize. Then we'll look at intensive and identical uses of the personal pronoun avtos, and we'll conclude by looking at the genitive circumstantial participle, otherwise known as the genitive absolute. Let's continue by looking at the vocabulary. Here we have contract verbs. Contract verbs are verbs that end in epsilon, alpha, or omicron. And in the vocabulary, they're organized by these three different types. The epsilon contract verbs are the most common. Eteo, I ask or demand. Aklutheo, I follow or obey. It takes the dative case. Dokeo, I think or suppose. I seem. Zeteo, I seek, search, or inquire. Theoreo, I behold or see. Kaleo, I call, name, or I invite. Laleo, I speak. Martureo, I testify or witness. Parakaleo, I exhort, encourage, I advise. Peripateo, I walk, live, behave. Prieo, I do, I make. Proskuneo, I worship, bow down. Teireo, I keep, guard, I obey. Phobeo, I fear, am afraid, or I respect. Alpha contract verbs include agapao, I love, adore, value. Genao, I bear, give birth. Eperotao, I ask, inquire. Erotao, I ask, inquire. Zao, I live. Omicron contract verbs include pleurao, I fill or fulfill, and phaneurao, I make manifest or I reveal. After learning vocabulary, you'll know 77% of the words in the Greek New Testament. Well, let's talk about contract verbs. Contract verbs are verbs that end in epsilon, omicron, or alpha. They are very stable verbs. They have verb stems that are very stable, and they really present a problem only in the first principal part. So if you look at this listing of the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth principal parts, you'll see the different formations. What will happen is that this contract vowel, the epsilon, alpha, or omicron, will lengthen before the endings in the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth principal parts. They're very regular. In fact, I like to think that these verbs set off the endings quite nicely for you to parse them. So you can see this across the second through sixth principal parts. Now the reason why these present no problems here is because these tenses are formed by adding a consonant in the coupling syllable with the ending on it. And so that consonant, either a sigma or a kappa or mu or theta, for example, will just abut to the contract vowel, and the only thing that it'll do is it'll lengthen it. An epsilon or alpha will lengthen to an eta, and the omicron will lengthen to an omega. The problem with the contract vowels in terms of recognition of the endings occurs really only with the first principal part. And the reason for that is that these endings begin with vowels, omicrons and epsilons, and these vowels will combine with the contract vowel in different patterns, and it will change the ending, the look of the ending just slightly. So what we need to understand in looking at contract verbs is the contract chart, that is, the rules of combination formation. So here's this chart that will help you to determine what the resultant combination, the contraction between the contract vowel and the ending will look like. So if the ending is an epsilon, as in the imperfect third singular active, then the resultant contraction is an epsilon iota. So you can just basically go down and look at these vowels or diphthongs or monophthongs and see what will result in the combination, the contraction between the contract vowel and those endings. You can see the rules here, some general patterns that might be helpful for you. Let's look at some of the particulars. The epsilon contract verbs are the most common in the New Testament. So if you had to choose one of these sets of contractions to study and really memorize or learn, it would be the epsilon contract. Here's the present active indicative, and you can see what happens here. Often you'll see a circumflex accent on the ending, and that's one clue that you have a contraction taking place with the verb. So in the singular, the endings they actually look like what you would normally expect. In the plural, you have some slight differences in the first person plural and second person plural. Otherwise, the third person plural looks the same. For the imperfect active, you have some changes though. And one of the most notable changes is in the singular, where you have the second person and third person endings all of a sudden looking like the primary active endings, is and is, rather than s and e. So that becomes tricky. The only way that you would differentiate that from the present tense forms is the present of the augment, the epsilon added to the front of the verb stem. In the plural, the endings are adjusted a bit. You see the circumflex accent, and then the third plural has a really kind of odd-looking form, un. For alpha contracts, there are more radical changes that occur. Most notably, the alpha will override the epsilon iota endings, and so you'll have a resultant alpha there. Also, something characteristic of alpha contracts is that when they meet up with an O-class vowel, that is an omicron or an omicron upsilon, they will convert that to an omega. So you'll see converting of omicrons to omegas in these endings. And you'll see alphas supplanting and replacing epsilon and epsilon iota endings. These same rules apply when looking at the imperfect. So the resultant forms are a bit odd looking and will throw you off. And so you'll have to remember the lexical form, and that this form is because of a contraction that's taken place between an alpha and the endings. Omicron contract vowels are the least common, and they follow certain patterns as well. The omicron will beat out the epsilon and replace it and add to it to form omicron upsilon in the endings, and you can see that list there. And in the imperfect active, you can see the same things there. Now the same rules apply for the middle passive forms. I've simply given you the active formations here for you to study. If you want to see a complete paradigm chart of these forms, look at Appendix 21. Well, let's talk about the intensive and identical uses of the pronoun avtos, avte, avton. This pronoun is a personal pronoun. It's a third person personal pronoun, has special uses. It can function adjectivally to take on special meanings. And one of the meanings is what's called identical, and it's translated same. And the other one is intensive and is translated with self, the word self added to a pronoun like itself or themselves or herself. The identical use is indicated by putting avtos in the attributive position. That is, treating it like an adjective with the article right in front of it. So whenever you see avtos agreeing with an article and the article right in front of it, it's functioning in a special way to mean same. So you can study these examples here. Now sometimes the pronoun avtos will stand alone, and it'll function like a noun or a substantive. So in this instance, o avtos is working alone and means the same one. Now the intensive use, in contrast, will never have the article in front of it, or very rarely. So it's functioning adjectivally, but not with the article in front of it. Now we've already encountered an intensive use of avtos when we've seen it working with the subject, that is, with a verb, and then it's present in the nominative case. And when it's present, it intensifies the subject of the verb. So see means he will save. So see. When you add the avtos, you're stressing the subject, and we would translate that he himself will save. So we've already encountered this with nominative forms working with the implied or expressed subject of verbs. This also happens, though, when working with nouns in other formations like prepositional phrases or as dative of time or any other kinds of nouns and their constructions. The pronoun can be added to that noun, agreeing with it in gender, number, and case. It won't have the article with it, in front of it, that is. It'll be working with that substantive and intensifying it. And so you can see these different instances here. Now sometimes the word self is not appropriate or doesn't seem very good in English, and another way that you can translate this intensive use is with the word very. The long and short of this discussion is that these uses of avtos are special uses. They're more emphatic. They're used to draw attention to the substantive or to stress identicalness in some substantive. So pay attention to these special uses of the personal pronoun. They're not all that common, but common enough to include in this beginning textbook. Now this brings us to consider the genitive circumstantial participle, or what is known as the genitive absolute. Now this use of the participle is one in which you have a circumstantial participle, that is, a participle that will not have the article with it, but it's found in the genitive case, and oftentimes it'll take a subject, which is a genitive case subject. Now this subject will govern that genitive participle. They work together, and so they must agree in gender, number, and case. Of course, the case is going to be genitive according to its name. So this genitive noun or pronoun will agree with the participle in number and gender. And this construction basically is starting a subordinate clause. And what it allows is for a switch of subjects, a switch of focus. And so it forms a subordinate clause around this genitive pronoun or noun and the genitive participle that that noun is subject of. Now this is perfectly fitting with the genitive case. Remember that the genitive case is a case of description. And so this is just a special construction that allows a subordinate clause to be formed in a way that allows for a separate subject to be that subject of that subordinate clause, which is different than the main clause. The main clause subject, remember, will be in the nominative case if present, and then this genitive absolute construction will allow for another subject to be present, but in the genitive case that is governing a genitive circumstantial participle. So you can see here a genitive absolute. After he entered Jerusalem. So is elthontos avtu is in the genitive case. This is a genitive absolute, and it's functioning as a subordinate clause in relation to the main clause, which is the whole city was stirred up. So in the main clause, the subject is the whole city or all the city. That's the subject. It's nominative. It's working with an aorist passive indicative verb. was stirred up, but with this main clause is a subordinate clause, which is indicated by a genitive case subject and a genitive circumstantial participle. So these participles will be in the genitive case. They tend to be at the beginning of the sentence, like at the beginning, normally preceding the main verb. Sometimes the genitive subject will be implied, it won't be explicit. But essentially these are circumstantial participles. That is, they will never take the article. And so aorist participles used in this way will tend to indicate time prior, and the helping word after might help set up that translation. Present participles will indicate time simultaneous, and the word while might help set that up. And sometimes, like I indicated, there won't be an explicit genitive noun. You'll have to supply that from context. So the basic use of these construction, the basic functions of a genitive absolute, genitive circumstantial participle, is that it allows for a switch reference. It allows a different subject to be acting within the clause. And it also provides an important segue or an important framework for what follows. And that's particularly if it's a pre-nuclear location. Now, if it's in a post-nuclear verb location, then it functions like a regular post-nuclear circumstantial clause, and that is that it's elaborating some aspect of the main verb. Well, if you want to read more about this construction, you can read the grade section. Be sure to look at the checkpoint, which will exercise your ability to work with and recognize participles, and there are some genitive absolute participles in there as well. And then the chapter concludes by looking at a case in point and looking at the unified Godhead that's present and affirmed in 1 Corinthians 12, 4 through 6. This may be one of my favorite case in points just because of this piece of art that's found at the end, representing and reflecting a certain worldview. So be sure to look at that and look at the apotheosis of Homer.